Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me on my talk today, The Fast Approach to Leadership. My name's Tredgold. I spent 25 years working in senior IT leadership positions, delivering $100 million projects, running $200 million departments, and today what I want to talk about is FAST, my approach to success. And how did I come up with FAST? Well, FAST is found out of failure, and there is no such thing as failure, there's only feedback. And it's what we do with that feedback that determines how successful we are going to be. We can choose to look at the feedback and decide that the mission ahead of us is impossible and quit, which is really the only true feedback. We can choose to ignore the information and carry on as before, but now we're flirting with insanity, because to do the same thing over and over expecting different results is one of the definitions of insanity. Or we can look to learn from our mistakes, understand them, adapt, and then try again. Thomas Edison, he failed 1,000 times when he invented the light bulb, and they asked him, what was it like failing over 1,000 times? And Thomas Edison said, I didn't fail 1,000 times. I developed a process which had 1,000 steps in it. So we need to be able to understand failure, embrace it, and learn from it. And this is what my talk's going to be about today. And one of the reasons I'm an expert in failure is it's not because of all the books I've read. I've read dozens of books on the topic. I've even spent thousands of hours studying failure. But the number one reason why I'm an expert in this is because I have failed so many times and in so many ways it would even make Thomas Edison blush. My first project I worked on was a 15-week project which I delivered 12 months late. My first $1 million project sticks out in my mind very clearly. It sticks out because the budget was only supposed to be $200,000. So I've experienced failure, and I've failed in many, many ways. And even when I thought I was going to be successful, I've managed to fail. My first job out of college, I was a production manager, and within a 3-month period, I managed to increase production by 75%, which was what I thought a great result. The only problem was we ran out of work. We completed 12 months' work for the factory within a 3-month period. We had to go on to a 2-day week. We laid off 2/3 of the staff, and the factory ended up being closed down and production being moved somewhere else. So I know about failure. I'm passionate about it, and this has caused me to do a lot of study and research into failure. And my background is in mathematics, and I'm really good at problem solving and pattern recognition, and I've studied the information to see whether there are any patterns that we can learn from. And as I've done this research into failure, I've found two important things. The first one is that failure is everywhere. Does anybody know what percentage of IT projects fail according to the research? If you've got an idea, just key it into the chat box and share that with me. Anybody got any thoughts on that? IT projects? Well, the number of IT projects that fail is over 60%. Thank you, David. It's over 60%. And 17% of large projects, and that's anything over $15 million, fail so badly they nearly bring about the failure of the company. And it's no better in business. In business, according to Forbes magazine, over 80% of first-time businesses fail. And when you look at product launches, a staggering 95% of product launches fail. And they fail for a whole number of reasons. And if we can look at these and understand them, then it's going to allow us to learn what we can do to fix it. And when you look at just product launches, 42% of all product launches fail, and they fail for the same reason. Does anybody know what that is? Again, If you could type that into the chat box, product launches, why do you think they would fail? It's a bizarre reason, and it's one that's eminently fixable. So, the number one reason why product launches fail 42% of the time is because there is no market for that product. That is a problem that we could avoid by, before we build our product, just asking, does anybody want this? So failure is all around us, and when we fail, it impacts our customers, our companies, our customers, and it also impacts us. And the second thing I've learned about failure is that there are 4 key causes of failure, and these are a lack of focus. We're not sure what it is we're trying to do, what our goal is. Accountability, we're not sure who's going to do the work, or we fail to hold them accountable. Third reason is a lack of simplicity. We have a natural tendency to overcomplicate things, and when we do that, we set ourselves down the path of failure. And then the last major reason for failure is a lack of transparency. We're not clear about what's involved, and we don't have great measurement to see whether we're on progress or not. And when we lack that visibility into progress, it can cause us to quit when we're making good progress because we don't know, and then we end up snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So what I want to do is I want to talk about each of these in turn and then give you some tips excuse me, that we can use to improve our focus, accountability, simplicity, and transparency. Because in my simple way of thinking, if those are the reasons why we fail, if we can avoid them, then we're going to put ourselves on the path to success. So let's start with focus. What is focus? So focus is about the what. What does success look like? What's our goal? What's our objective? And are we clear about that? Because when we're not sure about the goal and the objective, we can end up working on the wrong thing, aiming at the wrong target. And when we do that, our chances of success are nil. And it doesn't matter how good a job you do. When you're doing the wrong job, irrespective of how well you're going to do it, you're going to fail. And I do a lot of consulting with companies, and in a lot of companies I find that they're focused on the wrong what, and they don't even know that. And it's, in order to be successful, we need to correct that and make sure that we're focused on the right things. And a lot of the time, the reason they're focused on the wrong thing is because they're under such pressure, they just dive in and start trying to solve problems as quickly as possible. But Einstein says if he had an hour to save the world, he'd spend 55 minutes understanding the question and 5 minutes trying to solve it. And we need to be, as leaders, it's our job to take that step back and make sure that our teams are focused on the right thing. Peter Drucker says management is about doing things right. Leadership is about making sure we're doing the right things. So as leaders, it's our job to make sure that we don't dive in too quickly or we tell our teams to go too quickly. Because when we do that, we put ourselves in a position where we can misunderstand what it is we're trying to do. We solve the wrong problem and now we've failed. Another reason why we lose our focus is because we're under too much pressure. We have too many priorities, and when everything's a priority, nothing is a priority. I remember in my last job, my boss telling me, Gordon, these are your 6 number 1 priorities. Well, that's not going to work, because when time becomes an issue, which it will, I'm only going to be able to focus on one thing. And if I don't have a clear picture of success, and I'm now going to make a choice of which of these 6 things I'm going to focus on, the probability is I'm going to get it wrong. I've got a 5 out of 6 chance of getting it wrong, and when I get it wrong, I'm focused on the wrong thing, and when I'm focused on the wrong thing, it doesn't matter how good a job I do, I'm going to fail. And with our teams, often I see that we don't notice this and we can demand more work, longer hours, but that's just not going to work. The only result we'll get from that is a burnt out team who are deeply demotivated and also frustrated customers. Another thing that can cause us to lose our focus is alignment of bonuses. When I visit companies, I often ask them what are the company's objectives, and they'll tell me, oh, we're focused on A, B and C, which is fantastic. They've got great clarity. And then you ask them, what are the staff bonused on? And then they'll tell me, oh, we're bonus people on X, Y and Z. But if you bonus people for X, Y and Z and your goals are A, B and C, when time becomes an issue, people are going to focus on X, Y and Z, because that is where they're going to benefit. So we need to make sure that our bonuses are aligned with our goals. And if we don't do that, then we're going to put ourselves in a position where we're focused on the wrong thing and we can end up with a failure. I just want to now give you an example of what can happen when we get this wrong. Does anybody know this failure? It's the French train system. It was a big engineering failure, and it's going to cost them around 150 million. Does anybody know this failure? If you know what it is, please type into the chat. This happened in about 2013. France decided to organise and order 2,000 new trains. $15 billion project. 300 of the trains were delivered ahead of schedule. Fantastic, clean, efficient, very, very comfortable. They just had one issue. Does anybody know what that issue was? If you do, please type it into the chat. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to think about what that might be. Okay, well, the challenge with these trains was they are too big. These trains will not fit through 1,800 of the 2,300 stations in France. They will not pass through 25% of the tunnels under the Alps. And what's even more bizarre is one of the objectives of this project was to make the trains bigger. But nobody asked the question, how big would be too big? They didn't check all of the measurements, and now they've built trains that are not fit for purpose. Now, the impact of this is very interesting, because out of a $15 billion program, $150 million, the impact out of a $15 billion project is only $150 million. And that's well within the contingency, but think about the impact on France itself. I'm sure you can imagine that the people of England, Germany and France were all having a good laugh at this. You know, the reputation of the French engineers dropped significantly. France even managed to laugh at themselves about this. They had a cartoon on the front page of the newspaper that said, with the passengers on platform 1, please breathe in, your train's trying to arrive. And then you've got the impact on your customers, because you cannot fix 1,300 stations overnight. It's not like you can put sandpaper on the side of the trains and just drive them backwards and forwards. This is going to be a 2-year project to upgrade the stations in order to get them to be able to work throughout France. So that's going to be a 2-year delay to the full implementation. And then there's the personal impact. Imagine if you were the project manager. Would you want to go and see the Minister for Transportation in France and say, sit down, because you're going to laugh when I tell you what we've done? So this is what can happen when we get our focus wrong and we don't really have the right target in mind. And I want to give you now 3 tips that we can use to improve our focus. And we need to clarify our goals and objectives, make sure we know what success looks like. And there's some great reasons for doing this. One is that we're going to be aiming for the right target, and everything we do will move us forward. But also, according to the research by Dr. Gail Matthews at Dominican University in California, If you can write down your goals, you increase your chance of hitting it by 42%. And if you share your goals, you're going to be able to increase the chance of achieving them by 78%. So we need to be able to clearly articulate our goals, write them down, and then share them with the team. The second thing we need to do is we need to keep our priorities to a minimum. And in my experience, I would say no more than 3. A lot of people tell me, well, 3's not a lot, but if your goals are big, they break down into sub-goals. And if you've got 5 goals that then break down into 5 sub-goals, now you've got 25 goals, now you're focused on everything, and now you're focused on nothing. And the last company I worked with, Henkel, we had 3 goals to run the entire organisation. We had 14% profit, 5% organic sales growth, and 50% of revenue from emerging markets. And those 3 goals were enough to steer a $20 billion company, 48,000 employees, and we actually increased our performance by 40% increase in profit. So clear goals allow us to get everybody on the same page and pulling in the same direction. And then the third thing we need to do is we need to communicate these goals clearly, simply, and often to our teams. Remind them that the targets remain the targets, because people will see things that happen externally and think, oh, the target's changed. So we need to keep reminding them we are on target. At the last company I worked for, every one of the 48,000 staff knew what our goals were, and they were communicated to them and reinforced every single quarter. Because when we get the focus right, we've got everybody on the same page, and we've got everybody on the right page. And when you're pulling all in the same and the right direction, this is when you're going to be able to make significant improvements in performance. If you've got any questions about focus, please write them in the Q&A section, and I'll come to them at the end. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about accountability. And accountability is about, accountability is about the who. Who is going to be accountable for the work? Do they know they are accountable? And how are you going to hold them accountable? Things regularly fail because it wasn't clear who was accountable for the work. I can't tell you the number of times I've turned up at the airport with my wife and then asked her for the passport and tickets, only for her to tell me, oh, I thought you brought them. Even something as simple as that, if we don't have clarity over who's doing what, it's going to put us on the path to failure. And we need to have that clarity of role, but too often we need to have that clarity of role and then hold people accountable. But too often when people are managed, I see there's a reluctance to hold them accountable. But if you don't hold them accountable, then how are you going to ever improve things? In some companies where I've worked, things have been managed at such a high level that the only person held accountable was the leader. Now, whilst I believe the leader is accountable overall, each and every team member is accountable, or at least responsible for their part, and as such, they need to be held accountable to. And there's a couple of good reasons for this. The first is, if we don't know who's accountable for what, how can we ever give reward and recognition? Secondly, if the job's not going well, how can we provide the right feedback to the right person at the right time in order to see improvement? And the answer is, we can't. So if we truly want to see step changes in performance, then we need to break down accountability to the lowest levels, provide transparency into that performance, and then set expectations of what's required from that job and what outcomes we expect to see. And when this has been done, I've seen it empower teams. They now have an area that's under their control. It's clearly their responsibility, and they take ownership and pride in the results they generate, which helps us see a significant improvement. In many companies and countries I've worked in, they shy away from accountability. This is because They see it as an opportunity to name and shame, which is counter to their culture. But if we shy away from highlighting poor performance, we're also shying away from highlighting good performance, which is then going to demotivate our good performers. So when we're assigning accountability, we shouldn't see it as an opportunity to name and shame. We should see it as a positive step where we're looking to give people an opportunity to improve, and this is how it needs to be communicated. And in my experience, this has always been seen ultimately as a positive thing, but it depends how you implement it. My approach is always the same. When you first start to measure performance, you're always going to find it doesn't meet expectations. That's just the way things are. We're never accidentally doing a great job. And when we measure them, what we shouldn't do is humiliate or punish people. We should just say, okay, this is the beginning. We're only starting to measure it, and we're going to be looking to improve it, understand what's wrong, and put plans in place to improve it over time. But we also need to be clear with our teams that whilst this is the start, we do expect in 3 months, 6 months, for there to be improvements in performance. And this is a clear message that the performance it's not good enough, but it's okay for now, but we do expect to see improvement. And most teams want to improve. Everyone comes to work looking to do a good job. It makes work more fun and enjoyable, which is a lot better than the alternative. And as a leader, don't be afraid to hold people accountable. And when we do this, we must ensure that we provide them with the right tools, training and authority levels. Otherwise, we're just setting them up to fail. And it's also good to remind your teams that whilst they're accountable for a small part, we are accountable for for the overall thing. So we're actually aligned. We want them to do a good job because their good job is our good job. If they do badly, we're going to do badly. So we're in this together. And taking this approach will help build trust, and ultimately it will help drive performance to the next level by creating a culture of accountability. And it's the leader that sets the tone for the organisation. And in one company I worked for, my boss was constantly complaining that people were late for meetings, yet he was on average 10 to 15 minutes late for the majority of the meetings. This is when you set that kind of example, you're telling people it's okay to be late. So as leaders, we need to reflect the culture that we're looking for from our teams. And we need to make sure that we don't set up a blame culture or a culture of fear, because when we do that, that's going to kill accountability. And I want to just now cover an example of this. I don't know how many people would know this failure. If you do know what this failure is, it comes from Swedish naval history. Please feel free to key it into the chat box, but I'm not sure anybody will know this. I have been surprised a few times by people who visited the museum, but don't we feel too bad if you don't know this. This is a famous historical failure. This comes from Sweden naval history, and in 1626 King Gustav Adolphus of Sweden, he wanted to build a new ship. He demanded that his architects build a new ship that reflected the power and position of the Swedish Navy in the region. And the architects started to design what would have been one of the biggest boats in history, and it was going to have 64 cannons, and they designed the boat. And when the king saw the initial designs and the first building stages of it, he demanded that not 64 cannons, but 72 cannons. He wanted it to be the most fearsome ship in history. And the architects tried to tell him that it had been designed for 64, but he said, "Okay, I'm the king, I'm in charge, I get what I want, if I don't, heads will roll." So they tried to adjust the design to accommodate 72 cannons, but really they weren't in a position to be able to make total correction to accommodate that. And then as it got nearer to completion, the king came to see it again, looked at the ship, and he said, actually, I love the 72 cannons, it's really fearsome, but I want it to be beautiful as well. And what he asked was that they put a lot of statues, and you can see them on the back of the ship there. He wanted them to put statues around the back of the ship, and these statues were quite heavy. And again, the naval architects told him, look, this is probably not going to work because it's going to make the ship top heavy. And the king said, I'm in charge, I get what I want, if I don't, heads will roll. So they finished building the ship, and before its maiden voyage, the admiral of the fleet was concerned that it probably wasn't going to be that stable, so they decided to do some testing. They got the crew to stand on the left-hand side of the ship and then run to the right, and then when they got to the right, to come back, run to the left, and then run back to the right. And the ship was so unstable, before they'd gone back and forward twice, they had to stop because it was clear that the ship was going to be in difficulty and could possibly sink. But nobody was prepared to tell the king. He created this culture of blame and fear, and nobody's prepared to say anything. And the ship went out on its maiden voyage, and within the first mile there was a slight breeze. The ship became unstable, rolled over and sank, and over 30 of the crew drowned. And this is what can happen if we try to implement too much accountability and end up with a culture of blame and fear. It stops our teams from taking accountability and also from speaking up, because the research shows that on 75% of projects that fail, the teams knew before it even started that the project was doomed to failure. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we need to address this. One is because maybe the team does know something that's going to stop it from failing, and if we ask them and we encourage them to speak up, we might be able to find a solution to that problem. Or it could be there's a misunderstanding and we just need to clarify with them so they can understand. Because if our team go into a project with a mentality, and 75% of ones that fail have this, that the project is going to fail, then they're in what is called the I told you so camp. They'll work on the project, but as soon as it starts to fail, instead of stepping in and trying to fix things, they'll just step back, hands in the air, and say, I told you so. And that will then cause the project to fail. So when teams believe it's going to fail, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we need to do is we need to have our teams believing it's going to be successful, so when it starts to fail, instead of saying, I told you so, they look at it and say, quick, what can we do to fix it? They move to be proactive about fixing it and getting the project back on track. And when we do that, we're going to put ourselves in a much better position to succeed. So what can we do to increase our accountability? Well, here are 3 tips. We can have clear roles and responsibility and expectations. The clearer we are on roles and responsibility and communication of that, the more understanding our teams are going to have. And these don't need to be 200-page documents. We just need to communicate enough so that our teams understand what's required and what's expected of them. We also need to hold people accountable for outcomes, not process. When we hold people accountable for processes, what can happen is they follow the process, and when the project or the task fails, they don't feel accountable because they did what they were told. They followed the process. And if it fails, it's not their fault, it's the process's fault. When I was working in Germany, we had, this was the last summer there, we had 5 days of torrential rain. 6th day, it was 90 degrees. I'm driving into the office, and as I'm driving in, I see somebody from Parks and Recreation. They're stood in 9 inches of water with a hose pipe, and they're watering plants that are in 9 inches of water. I couldn't believe it. And when I got to my office, I called my team and I said, guys, Tell me what's going on, because this makes no sense. And they said, well, it's the rule in Germany. If it's 90 degrees, you have to water the plants. And I said, but these plants are in 9 inches of water. They said, it doesn't matter. That's the rule. And this is what can happen when we get people following process rather than accountable for outcomes. It would be clear to anybody the last things their plants needed was watering. But because it was the rule and he's followed the process, even if the plants die, it's not his fault. He did his job. So hold people accountable for outcomes, not process. And then lastly, be accountable. Leadership defines culture, and if the leader is accountable, the team will become accountable. And when we accept accountability, we're actually saying, I can do something to make a change here, and I'm going to do that. When we don't accept accountability, we're actually saying, there's nothing I can do to fix this. And if you do that, you're disempowering yourself to be able to have any impact over the outcome. So be accountable and get your teams to be accountable. So with focus, we're talking about the what. We're making sure we're aimed at the right thing. With accountability, we're making sure we've got the right person with the right tools doing that right job. And when we do that, it's going to ensure that everything we do is going to help us progress towards our goal. So if you've got any questions about accountability, please write them down, because now what I want to do is I want to go on to simplicity. So simplicity is about the how. How are we going to do our job? Have we kept it as simple as possible? And if it's a complicated task, and sometimes we just can't get away from complexity, have we explained it simply? Because complexity is the enemy of execution. And if we make things complicated, it will stop people from trying to do them, or it will make them do them incorrectly. And we have a natural tendency to overcomplicate things. I don't know if anybody knows who said this quote. Please put that in the chat. And the quote is, life is simple, but we insist on making it complicated. Does anybody know who made that comment? Because one of the things about complexity is we think it's a modern thing. But that was said by Confucius. So over 2,000 years ago, the situation was that life is simple and we tend to overcomplicate it. And when we overcomplicate things, we make them almost impossible to do. And I remember when I was 17, back in the late 70s, my dad worked for British Telecom, and his boss, John, who was an electrical engineer, very smart guy. He had a degree, master's and PhD in electrical engineering. He wanted to book a holiday in France. But back then, the only way you could do it, because there was no internet booking forms, there was no email, the only way you could do it was over the telephone. And he was convinced that his French wasn't good enough to be able to do this. And my dad said, well, we could ask Gordon, he's learning French, we'll get him to come in. So I went into my dad's boss's office. He said to me, I want you to call this number and ask them if we can book the first 2 weeks of August for the vacation. Is your French good enough to do that? And I said, yep, no problems. They said, okay. And I said, I want to know, are there any special things that we need to do for the booking? Can you ask that in French? And I said, yep, no problems with that whatsoever. So he dialed the number, handed me the phone. After a few rings, a lady came on the phone and she said, bonjour. And I said, bonjour, parlez-vous anglais? And the lady said, of course I speak English. I am English. How can I help you? And I said, I'd like to book the first 2 weeks in August. Now, John's face was livid because he just assumed it was more complicated than it was. He'd assumed that he would have to speak French and that his French wasn't good enough. And these two things caused him to not act and complete the task at hand. And this is what can happen when we overcomplicate things. Sometimes we can overlook simple solutions, and when we overcomplicate things for our teams, we can put them into a position where they don't understand, and it can cause them to cease to act. And in my experience, some of the worst people for this are the experts. Like John, he had a degree, master's, doctorate, yet he overcomplicated it. And experts are very good at making their own area complicated. Sometimes it can be, I feel, to make them look smarter than they are, or to make them feel valued, or to protect their area. But when we're dealing with experts, we have to get them to explain what's going on. We need to make sure we have clarity and understanding. And a lot of times when I do this and I challenge people, and I worked in IT, so I dealt with network engineers, hardware engineers, and when I challenged them, they would tell me, "Oh, Gordon, you don't know enough about hardware or networks, or this is extremely complicated. You're not going to be able to understand it." Every time somebody tells me that, I always remind them of Einstein's quote: "If you can't explain it, you don't understand it." And this is a challenge that we have to use with experts. And often they don't like it, because sometimes it can cause them to admit that they don't fully understand either the problem or the solution. And if they don't understand the problem, then how are they going to be able to solve it? And if they don't understand the solution, how are they going to communicate it to our teams so that they can understand it and implement it? The answer is they can't. So we need to challenge our teams and our experts. We need to get them to keep things as simple as possible, because people are not afraid of hard work. They're afraid of failure. And if people feel that they're going to fail, that it's more often that they actually will quit than work hard. So we need to give them that understanding of how we're going to be successful, so they can see and understand it. And when we do that, it motivates them to dive in, try and work hard. And I'll give you an example of this. When I decided 3 years ago, I wasn't a runner, and I decided I was going to run my first ever marathon, and I was going to do it in 6 months. And my two best friends said to me, "Gordon, you're too fat, you're too old, you're too unfit, you cannot do this." And I said, "But guys, I have a plan, a very simple plan." And they said, "Okay, tell us your plan." And I said, "Well, it involves running 5 days a week. You run, first day, you run for 15 minutes. Can I do that?" And they said, "Yeah, of course you can run for 15 minutes. And I said, "Day 2, you run for 15 minutes. Day 3, you run for 10, walk for 5, run for 5. And then on day 4, you run for 15 minutes. You take a day or 2 off, and on Sunday, you run for 20 minutes. And they said, "Yeah, you can do that." And I said, "Well, week 2, you run for 20 minutes and you follow that same process. You take Thursday, Friday off, and then on Saturday, you run for 25 minutes. And they said, "Yeah, you could do that." And I said, "Week 3 is exactly the same. You take Thursday, Friday off, and then on Sunday, you run for 25 minutes. And they said, "Look, of course, if you are only improving by 5 minutes, you're going to be able to do that. What's your point?" And I said, "Well, if you do that for 24 weeks, you end up being able to run for 4.5 hours. And my two friends looked at me and they said, "Wow, we'll run the marathon with you." And this is what can happen when we can show people step by step how they're going to be successful. So we need to make sure that we make things simple. But one of the things we need to do as well is we need to make sure that we don't overly simplify. Because Einstein says, keep things as simple as possible, but no more. Because simplicity isn't a continuum with simplicity at one end and complexity at the other. It's more circular. And as we start to simplify, once we make it too simple, it actually becomes overly simple. And I just want to give you an example of that. Does anybody know this failure? It started in 2004, and it cost the US government $5 billion, and it's related to the US Army uniform. If you know the answer to this, type it into the chat. Basically, what the Army wanted to do was they wanted to simplify the cost of uniforms by, instead of having a different uniform for each and every terrain, they would have one uniform, which they called the Universal Camouflage System, that would work everywhere, which is a fantastic idea. I really like what they're trying to do, because you have one camouflage, you can paint your tanks the same colour, your hardware, you can save an awful lot of money. There's only one problem with this. Can anybody guess where this worked? If you have an idea, just type it into the chat. Okay, well, this camouflage, which was designed to work everywhere, actually worked nowhere. They had complicated it so much that it didn't work on any of the terrain. This uniform is predominantly green and grey. The last two conflicts for the Americans have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, which are predominantly brown. So here we are in a situation where instead of having camouflage troops, you've got people that are dressed in green and grey against a brown background and now stick out like sore thumbs. And when you do that, you're putting your troops at risk. And it also makes you the laughing stock of the US Armed Forces. And as the project manager, this project was cancelled by Obama. Do you want to go and tell him you've wasted $5 billion on a uniform that didn't work because you made it too complicated? No, of course not, because you're not going to get another job. So I've had a little bit of a laugh at the French and the Germans and the Americans just to redress the balance. I thought I'd show a picture of the English camouflage, and as you can see, that works really, really well there, and you probably can't see them. So England no better than the Americans or Germans or Swedish and French when it comes to making mistakes. So how can we improve our simplicity? Well, there are three things that we can do. Challenge your teams to keep things as simple as possible. I always tell my teams the story of NASA and the pen, and that's where NASA didn't have a ballpoint pen that would work in space. So allegedly they spent $1 million in a year to design a pen that would work in zero gravity. Absolute genius. Whereas the Russians used a pencil. Now, it's not a true story, but it is a great learning aid, because what we should ask our teams is, when they design a solution, ask them, is there a pencil solution? Because if there is, that's the one we want to go with. Second thing we need to do is challenge everything, and if it's not needed, stop doing it, because complexity can creep up on us. In my last company, we used to produce shampoo, and we used to use a lot of blue bottles, and I'd ask you to guess how many different shades of blue, but I don't believe you could come up with a number. We had over 400 different shades of blue. That is crazy complexity, because we used to make the bottles, buy the bottles, different packaging, and by rationalising that down from 400 to 100, we actually cut $3 million from our production budget. But even at 100 shades of blue, it's still too complicated. We need to challenge everything. If it's not needed, don't use it. And then lastly, what I call it's the Pareto, the 20% rule. Just assume you have 20% of the time available, and then ask yourself how you're going to do that. Because when you only assume you have 20% of the time available, it forces a mindset shift that causes you to think about things differently. If you've only got 20%, you can't just take your current approach and incrementally improve it. You need to think differently. So challenge your teams, ask them as a pen solution, challenge everything, and assume you've got 20%, and try and get that mindset shift, because the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at keeping things simple. So if you have any questions on simplicity, please write them down and I'll get to them at the end. So the last part of FAST is transparency, and transparency is about truth and knowledge. It's about how far do we have to go, and how far have we gone. And regularly when you hear that a project failed, it's because it's been more complicated than people thought it was, and it's because they lack transparency into what was needed. Gartner will tell you that on average projects cost 3 times the initial estimate, and this is because they're like icebergs. We can all see that top third above the water, but it's the 2/3 below the water that are going to sink the ship. So we need to have a full picture into what's needed. The second part of transparency is we need to have data-based progress reports. We need to have real-time performance. I don't know how many of you use earned value analysis, but those are fantastic tools. A little bit complicated, but they give you great visibility into exactly where we are, because we need to be able to track and trace our performance. Because if we don't have it, it's like running a race blindfold, and after 5 minutes, you don't know where you are, you don't know where your competition is, you don't know where your finishing line is, and consequently, you're not going to be successful. So we need to have that, and there's so much data available with all the analytics, the cost reports, finance reports, staffing reports. We need to be making data-based decisions all of the time. In God we trust, everybody else bring data. Because when we have that data-based performance figures, it allows us to be able to see whether we're on track. And if we're on track, we can give our team that positive feedback, good job, well done. If they're not, then we can say, what do we need to do in order to improve performance? And if we don't have it, it can cause us to snatch defeat from victory. And I've run a number of marathons now. When I first started, my first 3 marathons I ran in 5 hours 15, 5 hours 12 and 5 hours 2. And for my best friend's 50th birthday, we were going to run the Athens Marathon of the original distance. And I thought, what a fantastic place to break 5 hours for the marathon. And I did all of the due diligence. I knew that because it was the original where they'd run from the Battle of Marathon to Athens, it was going to be a slightly different course. It would be wouldn't be as flat, and it was predominantly uphill, and uphill from mile 6 to 20. And I knew that after 1 hour I need to be at 6 miles, 2 hours at 18, 3 at 24, at 3 at 18, 4 at 24, and then I'll be able to cruise in. And after 23 miles and 2 hours and 12 minutes, I was bang on track. But then my iPhone battery died, and I lacked visibility into my performance. And I ended up crossing the finishing line. Even though I should have had plenty of time, I crossed it in 5 hours and 9 seconds. All because I lacked visibility into my performance at the end. So we need to make sure we've got visibility, because I could have found another 9 seconds. I could have skipped the coffee in Starbucks at mile 25. We need to be able to see where we are, so that if we are on track, we can keep going, or if we're a little bit behind, we can give that extra push. And we also need to make sure that we do the due diligence and understand. Here's a great failure that I like to share with people. This comes from 1977. It's the Kenner toy failure, where Kenner organisation won the right to build the plastics figures for Star Wars, and they based their production numbers on Star Wars grossing $20 million. Star Wars grossed $20 million in its first month, and what happened was, the film came out in May. They completely underestimated the production, and it got so bad that they couldn't actually meet the demand, because this became the must-have toy for Christmas 1997, and they ended up selling empty boxes with certificates. Now, they still made $40 million in revenue, but can you imagine how much more money? And this was all because they didn't understand what was involved, what that demand was going to be. So we need to be able to get some clarity, and maybe they could be forgiven for not being able to predict it, but within that first month, Star Wars took 20 million, and they should have reacted at that point. So what can we do to increase our transparency? We need to make sure we do the due diligence. When you think you know you've got enough, all of the work that's involved. Ask yourself, can I only see the third of the iceberg that's above the water? This doesn't mean look for extra work. It means just check that you haven't missed the 2/3. Second thing we need to do is we need to create a plan of progress, like a GPS for your business. It's great to track cost and effort, but we also need to track output, because we want to use this to hold our teams accountable. We hold them accountable for outcomes, so create a plan of outcomes. After 10% of the project, we should have completed 10%. After 20%, we should have created 20% of the product. And if it's a slightly different, that you need to invest 20% for the first 10 and you get a big increase at the end, that's great if you know that, but plot it out and track it. And then lastly, communicate the progress to your team, because when we do that, when they start to see the progress, it's going to motivate them to keep going and give them that confidence that we're going to be successful. So FAST is about focus, accountability, simplicity, and transparency. These are the 4 things that cause us to fail. So if we can improve our performance in each one, it's going to put us on the path to success. A lot of people ask me, if I could only do one, which would it be? Well, you have to do all 4, because if we can fail because of poor performance in all of them, in order to do well, we need to do well in all 4 of them. Another question people ask me is, if I could only do one, which one should I do first? And the answer to that depends. If it's an ongoing initiative, score yourself out of 5 for focus, accountability, simplicity, and transparency. And wherever you score lowest, start there. If it's a new initiative, like FAST, it starts with F, focus. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then you definitely can't figure out who you need and how you're going to track it. So it all starts with focus. If we can get the focus right, then we're going to put ourselves on the path to success. So when you go back and start looking at your own projects, I would ask you to ask yourself, do I have the right focus? Do I know what success looks like? Do I have clarity around my goals? And have I communicated them to my team? Do I know who's involved? Have I communicated it to them and told them the outcomes they're looking for, and making sure that they've got the right tools, authority, and skills to do the job? Have I kept the process of how we're going to do it as simple as possible and communicated it as simple as possible? And lastly, do I have the right transparency? Do I know what's involved, and do I know how I'm going to track my performance? Because when you can do all of those, there is no such thing as failure. There's only success. So that's my FAST approach to leadership. I've used it to run $100 million projects, turn around $200 million departments, run marathons, write books. FAST works everywhere, because the causes of failure are the same everywhere, whether it's a large corporation, a small company, or a personal goal. So if you've got any questions, we've got about 7 minutes that I can go through answering them. So first question I've got is about how do you make people take ownership? Well, the way to do that is to make sure that they've got all of the tools and skills and resources and time that they need. And the best way to do that is to ask them, do you have the right tools, the right skills? Do you have everything you need in order to be successful? And when people say yes, now they've taken ownership. If people don't say yes, they haven't taken ownership, because we cannot delegate accountability. It has to be accepted. How do you get peers to stay focused on the end goal? Is that part of managing or leading? Well, leading is about setting the goal and explaining what it is, and then managing is about making sure that people keep going. And everybody wants to work and play for a winning team. So what we need to do is we need to have that transparency and show them that their effort is getting translated into results. And if you can show people that their effort is being translated into results, then they'll remain focused. People's focus, tends to wander when they cannot see progress from their efforts. This is when people start to think about doing other things or start to quit. So any more questions that you'd like me to answer on FAST? Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I hope that this talk on FAST was useful to you and that you'll go away and use it. FAST does work. And if you've got any comments or questions, then please feel free to email me at gordon@gordontredgold.com or via Twitter on at gordon@gordon.tredgold.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.